Marta Pelaez is President and CEO of Family Violence Prevention Services, Inc., a San Antonio-based nonprofit established in 1977 to provide the tools towards the self-sufficiency of victims of domestic violence. The organization began as an emergency shelter for women and children. It now offers a comprehensive array of residential and non-residential programs and services to help individuals and families recover from the pain and long-term effects of abuse. The Battered Women and Children's Shelter provides 24-hour crisis intervention, legal, medical, educational, and therapeutic services to over 6,000 individuals a year. Marta has a master's degree in clinical psychology and has dedicated more than 2 decades of professional service to vulnerable populations, mostly children. Collaborating with local schools and universities, she helped create educational programs to advance the victim's self-sufficiency. She has worked with the judicial and protective systems to break through traditional siloed approaches to social services. She has championed initiatives to engage different sectors of the community in the development of life-changing, culturally relevant interventions for both victims and perpetrators of abuse. Marta is a frequent contributor to local and national media and was a guest of Bill Moyer's PBS documentary, The Journal. She has provided testimony before Senate committees on issues related to the allocation of funding for programs and the advancement of laws for the protection of victims. Marta places special emphasis on the critical need to understand the generational impact of domestic violence on children. Marta created and now co-chairs the Bexar County Domestic Violence Task Force. She has participated twice by invitation as a panelist for the Commission on the Status of Women of the United Nations in New York. Marta is a wife, 3 times a mother, and grandmother.
Good morning or afternoon, whenever it is that we are together today. My name is Marta Pela. I'm the President and CEO of Family Violence Prevention Services, the Battered Women and Children's Shelter. Thank you very much for allowing me to have this conversation with you all, this very, very important exchange. I hope that it will be of some value to you all. We have a very serious situation in our community with domestic violence. So the more people that are informed, the more people that understand what it is and what is not, the better. So you will become ambassadors of ours by the end of this presentation. I believe you have received a small bio sketch with everything that I have done through the years, but namely, I have been doing this work to advance the mission of Family Violence Prevention Services for the past 20 or 21 years. My background is in clinical psychology, which I have put at the disposal of the mission of Family Violence Prevention Services, the Battered Women and Children's Shelter. We're one and the same. So let me just give a little bit of information on who we are. We have been in place providing services and the tools for the self-sufficiency and independence from abuse to adults and children for the past 44 years. It was a time when the term domestic violence wasn't even coined. So we have really been pioneers in the nation, the state, and in the world, if you will, in the movement against domestic violence. So at this point, I will go and recall my slides. Okay. This here. And okay, so historically, Chinese women were among the most oppressed in the world. They bore the brunt of child marriage, illiteracy, and forced prostitution, among other evils. Mao Zedong changed it all. He famously said, "Women hold up half the sky," which it has literal meaning in Texas because women make up 50.4% of the population. This quote is well used to understand and underscore the importance of equality and the recognition that lack of equality solidifies significant continued deficiencies and much victimization around the world. So while some say that through the years there have been very important advances in domestic violence, others say that the needle has not moved one iota from the days when Roman civil law in 454 BC gave us patria potestas, or patriarchy. It gave absolute power to the husband or father over the members of his family. Wife and children became the property of the husband. The women would lose their identity, their last name, and would adopt that of the husbands. While I go through some of these most relevant events that have made history in the movement against gender inequality and the domestic violence movement, consider if the needle has moved a lot, perhaps not enough, or maybe not at all. So I present to you some chronological entries beginning with 450 through 454 BC. Of course, I promise not to go through every year. During the Middle Ages, theological writings supported inferiority of women, and some added the view that women were susceptible to demonic influence and in need of beatings to fight the devil's spell. The last 2 centuries have seen legislative and social attempts at protection and empowerment of women, including the right to an education. Such is the case in 1869, for example. Harvard University opened its doors to women, but they had been, for the previous 50 years, their doors had been open to men. In 1871, Alabama became the first state to repeal the legal right of a husband to beat his wife. That is, if she reported it, if she was believed, and if legislative protections had not been circumvented by parallel laws such as the Stitch Law. The Stitch Law referred to a woman's ability to prevail before a court only if her injuries merited stitches. In 1920, women were allowed to vote by men. In 1974, the North Carolina Supreme Court judge said, and I quote, "If no permanent injury has been inflicted, nor malice, cruelty, nor dangerous violence shown by the husband, it is best to draw the curtain, shut out the public gaze, and leave the parties to forget and forgive." That became known as the Curtain Law. In 1974, the Credit Equality Act allowed women to apply for credit cards. Perhaps some people in the room today remember that. I certainly do. It was a proclamation to equal contribution to debt. In other words, as women were allowed to contribute to the debt of the household. How exciting is that? In 1977, shelters began opening doors throughout the nation. We opened our doors in 1977. We're the 10th program to provide services for victims of domestic violence. But remember, I shared with you that at the time, the term domestic violence wasn't even coined. We all knew that there was this dysfunction in homes, and that wives and husbands would go at it, and that the woman would end up with a lot of physical and traumatic experiences, and she would arrive at the shelter with her children. So we began by, we had a small house, and we, like I said, opened doors to receive these women, and offered some respite from that situation that had no name. And she would stay perhaps 2 nights, perhaps an entire week, and then she would move on. In 1978, the Pregnancy Discrimination Act was signed into law, which prevented a woman to be fired from her workplace for being pregnant. But we know that the practice very quietly is still enforced in many places, many workplaces. In 1980, President Carter declared March 8th the International Day of Women. To this day, I continue to dream of 365 days that we celebrate womanhood, not just one day. In 1990, Senator then Joseph Biden introduced the Violence Against Women Act, VAWA, before Congress. However, that was not signed into law until 1994 by President Bill Clinton. The VAWA is reauthorized every 5 years, and as of late, this past reauthorization of the VAWA Act was held in the Senate for several months, in fact, almost a year before it was reauthorized. In 1990, in the 1990s, stalking was identified as a crime, in spite that 90% of all homicides were stalked and beaten the year prior to their death. In 1993, marital rape became a crime. Only 1993. It's still treated differently than other types of rape or contexts of rape. In 2009, so this is a very quick travel through memory lane. I did promise you that I would not go through every year. So in 2009, strangulation became a felony in cases of domestic violence. Before, it was a misdemeanor. That's how it was treated in the courts. But because today we know so much more about strangulation and what it does to the human body, to the victim, it was elevated, and because of public policy efforts here in Texas, yours truly participated then, so it became a felony. When there is strangulation in domestic violence cases, the lethality of the relationship becomes 700% higher. So the risk of being killed by the abuser after he's strangulating, it's elevated 700%. In 2018, Bexar County experienced the highest number of femicides per capita in the state of Texas. So we occupy and have been occupying for some years now a place of dishonorable distinction when it comes to domestic violence and, coincidentally, also child abuse. We have had the highest indices in the nation. In 2018, we saw 28 fatalities, 28 femicides. This is not in the slide, but I would like for you to please keep a mental note of where we are today, 2020. There have been already 33 femicides to date. This is August, so it is unrealistic to think that the number will stand by the 31st of December. So about that needle, what do you think? In terms of these few chronological entries, historical entries, have we moved the needle far enough? Not enough? That, of course, is something that we're not going to answer here, but it's something to ponder over. Before we go any further, I think it's important to understand what domestic violence is, how it is defined. The legal definitions are often more narrow. The public health definition includes a broader range of controlling behaviors, emotional abuse, physical abuse, social isolation, stalking, intimidation. The Texas Code, Family Code, defines family violence, and I'm going to read because I'm going to make a point later on. It defines it as follows. It is an act by a member of a family or household against another member of the family or household that is intended to result in physical harm, bodily injury, assault, or sexual assault, or that it is a threat that reasonably places the member in fear of imminent physical harm, bodily injury, assault, or sexual assault, but does not include defensive measures to protect oneself. So if any one of you finds in need of legal action and defense, this is what a court of law will use to look at your case. The CDC, an agency we have heard plenty of in the last 6-7 months related to coronavirus, the CDC's uniform definition of intimate partner includes physical violence, sexual violence, stalking. There is one more element that is not there in the Texas Code: psychological aggression, including coercive tactics by a former or current intimate partner, spouse, boyfriend, girlfriend, dating partner, or ongoing sexual partner. And then there is, of course, Marta's definition. I define it as a pattern of progressive behaviors in a relationship where one member aims at controlling the other through emotional, psychological, physical, sexual, or financial means. Two very important words make up my definition of domestic violence, and that is pattern and progressive. Domestic violence isn't necessarily someone coming with a gun at you. Domestic violence is what has happened before that awful act of aggression coming with a gun at you happens. Perhaps, and if that gun that goes off and kills someone, that may be the end of the cycle of domestic violence, but it never is the beginning. Domestic violence is a progressive phenomenon. It begins with very subtle aggression, very subtle. You would not even call it aggression in the early stages. Put downs, name calling, controlling behaviors that with time progress into more severe aggression, perhaps going into physical aggression. So there's shoving, slapping, pushing, and again, a pattern is established, and if nothing is done to stop it, it may end up with that gun coming at you. Many definitions of domestic violence, and let me go back to that, the family code. As you can see, it refers exclusively to physical harm, bodily injury, assault, or sexual assault. So it is very, very easy to, not very easy, but it is easier to evidence and demonstrate that bodily harm has occurred than it is to demonstrate and evidence that psychological abuse has happened. So, coercive control. Researcher Evan Stark coined the term coercive control to refer to the many ways an abuser might dominate and control every aspect of a victim's life without ever putting a hand on her. So it's the isolation, is the denigration, is the obscurity of the woman in the home. Even in her parenting, she's controlled, she's checked and double checked. She is, her self-esteem is eroded. She is controlled at all times, where she goes, where she comes from, who she has called, whose phone calls she has received, how much she spends. So all of those behaviors bring about trauma that is difficult for a victim to summarize and bring before a legal court for her defense. However, they are very palpable and they are extremely traumatizing. A woman can go through years of coercive control and psychological behaviors, psychological trauma, without, as the definition says, ever being battered or physically abused. So nationally, 1 in 4 women will experience domestic abuse in her lifetime. In Texas, however, is 1 in 3. And unfortunately, Bexar County has pushed that statistic to make it 1 in 3. Domestic violence and child abuse coexist. I have very personally been fighting for the siloed-like categorical approaches that maintain and have maintained historically the two issues divorced from each other. When domestic violence occurs in the presence of children, rest assured the children are being abused. A child feels tremendous guilt, tremendous sense of impotence, and anger that is pent up and shown later when that child perhaps becomes a teenager and is beginning to date, beginning to explore relationships, and the child, becomes then now the abuser. So at so many levels, domestic violence in the presence of children is very traumatic for the child. Imagine the situation that we lived at our shelter many years ago, several years ago. There was a mother that arrived at the shelter having been released from the hospital because she had had 21 stab wounds in her hands. She knew she needed to get a divorce from the husband of 18 years. And she was saving every little coin and dollar bill that this husband would leave laying around so she could put herself through cosmetology school so she could in turn save some money to pay a retainer to an attorney to get a divorce. She was determined. She needed to do that. And she would do whatever it would take to get there. She was cutting her friend's hair, practicing what she had learned in cosmetology school. He returned home and unexpectedly, and stabbed her 21 times in her hands. This was done in the presence of her 3 children, ages 17, 13, and 11. She was also expecting a 4th child. It was the children who pushed the father away from the mother so that he would not finish her. It was the children who wrapped the mother's hands in the sheets. It was the children who ran to the neighbors. And the children were the ones who called the police. When the woman came to us, released from the hospital with heavy, very bulky bandages in her hands, she actually looked like a boxer with her boxing gloves on. Only 2 of her children came with her. The 3rd child, the oldest one, the 17-year-old, was found days later by the police. He was hiding in the bushes, holding the same knife that the father used to assault the mother. And he said that he was waiting for the father to come back to the house so that he would do the same thing to him. So this very painful illustration shows how severe is the trauma on the children. If the children are not intervened properly and timely, you will have the next generation ready to go and display aggression and brutality against women in the next when it's their time. So in little girls, you will have someone who a little girl who has gone through the model that mom presented of denial, quietly taking the beatings and the denigration. She will learn what her place is in society as she grows up. Same thing with the little boy that grows up watching the father being the king of the house, disrespecting every member of the family. He too will get the cues from those incidents, understanding that his place in society is one of brutalizing and battering and victimizing women. So, to the impact on the community, well, it's a very easy, straight arrow from the family to the community, since the family is the most important and basic social cell. If the family is well, the community will be well. If the family is not well, the community as a whole will not be well. It impacts the workplace. It impacts every aspect of the community. In fact, domestic violence can be seen concentrically as an issue that is directly related to child abuse, substance abuse, human trafficking, the high number of incarcerated individuals, teen pregnancy, gang membership, high-risk youth, indices of criminality in a community, such that if we could remove domestic violence from the center of a community, all of these other issues would begin to be resolved. I forgot to mention child abuse, directly related to domestic violence. So what services are there, and what can we expect a victim to receive when she is referred to the Battered Women and Children's Shelter? Who is this victim? She is a 36-year-old mother of 3, ages 5, 3, and 6 months. So she arrives at the shelter perhaps on a Saturday, 2 o'clock in the morning. She's brought by the police. She is wearing maybe a torn blouse. Perhaps it's showing some blood. The children are looking very scared. Perhaps they're crying. They're asking mommy to, let's go back home. We don't want to be here. It's a very traumatic experience. From that point on, we try to bring stability, emotional stability to that family. She's of course, the first thing that she receives is a more likely a hug, a very sincere hug, letting her know that she has arrived at a place that will look after her safety and that of her children. The children may be invited to follow one of our children's specialists while the mother tells us what has happened, and an intake is done on her. After that, we have services, case management, Safety planning, which is very important, is done. Legal services, perhaps she needs to press charges. She is presented with legal options to include protective order, a divorce, all of that, no charge whatsoever. There's counseling, support groups. There is a clinic that takes care of her primary medical needs, a dental clinic as well, and child protective services liaison in case she comes to us with some history in that agency. So she she has access to all of those services. There is parenting and many more programs designed to help. That is the first part of her stay with us. If when all of her goals in the emergency crisis program are fulfilled, then she moves on to the self-sufficiency aspect of our mission at the shelter. And there is education with a scholarship program. There is transitional housing, several housing programs that take her between 3, 6, and 12-month possibilities. And of course, supportive services will continue to be delivered to the family as they need them. We are an agency of programs. We have non-residential services. Not everybody is ready to come to the shelter. Not everybody should come to the shelter or is appropriate for the shelter. Some people just want the abuse and the lack of respect to stop. For those people, there is a non-residential number of programs that also for the children as well. Knowing, as I already shared with you, that they are not spectators in cases of domestic violence, but that they are directly traumatized. So for those people that want to receive non-residential services, we have counseling, A Mother's Journey, which is the name of our parenting program. There is that CPS liaison, Celebrating Families, which works hand in hand with the courts to provide assistance to parents who have been abusing substances and their children as well. Counseling for the children exclusively. Court liaison, we have an office in the courthouse. Intervention for abusers, a very important aspect of our agency. Just as we provide services for the victims, we also have and recognize that if there is anything to be done in reference to domestic violence in general, we have to also pay attention to those who abuse and who bring so much pain. Otherwise, it is kind of a revolving door. So I will speak a little more in depth about what batterers intervention for abusers is. We also are data gatherers. We document and collect data about every aspect of what we do for victims, for adults and children victims, and for the perpetrators of abuse. So how do we measure success? Individually, we have a service plan, we have surveys, we are very closely in touch with those that receive our services and to give them an opportunity to provide us with their input. At the shelter and agency-wide, it is the rate of recidivism. Nationally, 28% of women who go to shelters go back to shelters 7 times before they sever their relationship with the abuser. 7 times. So that 28% for us is 7.4. That is 7.4% of women who come to our shelter come back to the shelter more than once. So even though is a very, very low number in reference to the national statistic of 28%, but still it is our desire, and we look for this number to be 0%, but it depends on the individual circumstances of each victim. I said I would explain a little more in depth what Batterers Intervention Prevention Program is. Number one, it's a statutory program. That means that it is mandated by the law that judges refer abusers to a BIP, Batterers Intervention Prevention Program. And if there is anything that you would remember about a BIP, I want it to be that in contrast with anger management, the Batterers Intervention Prevention Program is a lengthy, substantial, a robust approach to attitudes, pervasive attitudes that precede the actions of abusers. So we go after the attitudes. That is why it's lengthy. Is a minimum of 20 weeks where they go through a very rigorous curriculum that includes child development, their very own childhood, because domestic violence, as I said before, comes from having had models of domestic violence. It was learned from someone. So anger management is, by contrast, is an intervention that has its locus of control on external factors. I explain. If the environment is not conducive to your controlling your anger and your aggression, you can blame the environment. It's because the soup had too much salt. It's because I was fired from my workplace. It's because I have a headache. It's because the children are screaming and you are not keeping the children quiet, and therefore here it comes. That is anger management. The environment is controlled for the abuser, and so stress, de-stressing exercises are advised, and removing oneself from the situation and take a walk is also part of what makes anger management. We take domestic violence and abuse much more seriously than that. This is a science-based intervention that has its locus of control internally. The abuser learns to consider and to go to the attitude that provided the impetus to raise his hand and hit his wife, to raise his hand and hit his girlfriend, to raise his hand and hit the children. So there is accountability and responsibility. I have this next slide presents that contrast very clearly. Also, the Batterers Intervention Prevention Program is one that is monitored very closely and funded by the Criminal Justice Department Assistance Division. There is a very rigorous training that we go through in order to be certified to provide the intervention. So it is something that, as I said, is statutory. It's mandated by the courts. Probation also mandates, refers abusers to a batterers intervention, certified batterers intervention program. The parole, municipal court, and all of the other civil and criminal courts as well. And we come to the end of my conversation with you this morning, or afternoon, whatever it may be. My telephone number and the telephone number at the shelter is 210-733-8810. 210-733-8810. I hope you never have to use it. And if you contact me, it's because you want to learn more. You want to obtain perhaps some printed resources that we will make available to anyone who needs them. But I certainly wish for all of you never to be touched by this problem. And I reveal now the rest of the quote by Mao Zedong: "Women hold up half the sky, the heavier half." I thank you very much for your attention, and I wish you good fortune. Bye-bye.